The 18th century, or at least the years of that century preceding the French Revolution of 1789, is commonly known in European history as the Age of Enlightenment. This broad term may simplify or distort the era's complex currents of cultural and political change, but no other name describes so many features of the time so well. Many Europeans strongly believed that they were living in a new, more enlightened age, and it is from their own evaluation of themselves that our term Age of Enlightenment is derived. Everywhere there was a feeling that Europeans had at last emerged from a long cultural twilight. The past was generally regarded as a time of barbarism or darkness, in which people knew much less about the laws of nature and the value of rational analysis. The sense of progress was all but universal among the educated classes. It was the belief both of the forward-looking thinkers and writers known as the philosophers and of the forward-looking monarchs, the enlightened despots, together with their ministers and officials. The leading ideas of the Enlightenment, optimistic beliefs in the historical advance of reason, science, education, social reform, tolerance, and enlightened government, have been constant themes in the modern world. The Enlightenment, in short, remains a dynamic tradition in cultural and political life. Intellectual debates since the 18th century have almost always returned, explicitly or implicitly, to questions about the validity and legacy of Enlightenment conceptions of truth, knowledge, and progress. The Enlightenment has often been challenged or condemned by influential cultural movements, for example, Romanticism, postmodernism, new or resurgent religions, and by modern political ideologies, for example, fascism, ethnic nationalisms. Yet the vehemence of its modern critics confirms the Enlightenment's exceptional, enduring importance in the cultures and politics of modern societies. The philosophy's philosophe is simply French for philosopher, but to be philosophical in the 18th century meant to approach any subject in a critical and inquiring spirit. The French word is used in English to denote a group of writers who were not philosophers in the sense of treating ultimate questions of knowledge or existence. They were social or literary critics, popularizers, and publicists. Most philosophers were men, but many women also participated in Enlightenment culture. The French writer Émilie du Châtelet, for example, translated Newton and explained the significance of the new theories in her scientific essays. Though often learned, the philosophies wrote to gain attention, and it was the philosophies who spread the ideas of the Enlightenment across Europe and the Atlantic world. Formerly, authors had generally been persons of leisure or talented protégés of aristocratic or royal patrons, or professors or clerics supported by the income from religious foundations. In the Age of Enlightenment, a great many were freelancers, grub streeters, or journalists. They wrote for the public. The reading public had greatly expanded. By the 1780s in France, literacy rates had risen to 47% among men and 27% among women. The educated middle class, commercial and professional, was much larger than ever before. Women readers formed a growing audience for novels and literary journals. Country gentlemen sought new scientific advice on agriculture, and even noblemen wished to keep informed. 590 newspapers and magazines multiplied, and people who could not read them at home could read them in coffee houses or in reading rooms organized for that purpose. There was a great demand also for dictionaries, encyclopedias, and surveys of all fields of knowledge. The new readers wanted matters made interesting and clear. They appreciated wit and lightness of touch. From such a public, literature itself greatly benefited. The reading public 591. The style of the 18th century became admirably fluent, clear, and exact, neither ponderous on the one hand nor frothy on the other. Such writings attracted new readers in every country, from the interior of Europe to the America of Benjamin Franklin. People began to talk of public opinion as a kind of critical tribunal that judged the significance of new books and established or destroyed the reputations of ambitious authors. This new public opinion, the French writer Malesherbes explained, was an independent social force that all powers respect, that appreciates all talents, that pronounces on all people of merit. Critical reviews of literature, art, and music provoked debates in newspapers, journals, and coffee houses, all of which contributed to an expanding public sphere beyond the personal world of private households and outside the official world of government institutions. The bourgeois middle class was becoming not only educated, but also thoughtful and critical. But the expanding public sphere was not limited to the ideas or cultural preoccupations of a single social class. The writings of the day were nevertheless affected by social conditions and by the cultural context that constrained their publication. They were all written under censorship. The theory of censorship was to protect people from harmful ideas as they were protected from shoddy merchandise or dishonest weights and measures. In England, the censorship was so mild as to have little effect. Other countries, such as Spain, had a powerful censorship. France, the center of the Enlightenment, had both a complicated censorship and a large reading and writing public. 321, the Church, the Parliament of Paris, the royal officials, and the printers' guilds all had a hand in the censoring of books. French censorship, however, was loosely administered, and after 1750, writers were little disturbed by it. It cannot be compared to the repressive censorship of more recent authoritarian governments. Yet in one way, it had an unfavorable effect on French thought and letters. It discouraged writers from openly or explicitly addressing concrete public questions. Legally forbidden to criticize church or state, they threw their criticisms on a more abstract level. Barred from attacking matters in particular, they tended to attack matters in general. Or they talked of the customs of the Persians and the Iroquois, but not the French. Their works became full of double meanings, sly digs, innuendos, and jokes, by which authors, if questioned, could declare that they did not mean what all the world knew they did mean. As for readers, they developed a taste for forbidden books, which were always easy enough to obtain through illicit channels and foreign booksellers. Censorship, 5 and 92, Paris was the heart of the movement. Here, in the townhouses of the well-to-do, literary and social celebrities gathered for literate conversation. It might occasionally happen that a notable philosopher was also wealthy. Such was the case of Helvetius, who not only wrote books on the mind and on man, but also gave grand entertainments at which such matters were discussed. Mainly, however, this mingling of people and ideas went on in salons conducted by women who became famous as hostesses or salonières, and who played a crucial mediating role in what came to be called the Republic of Letters. Madame de Geoffrin, for example, for a period of 25 years beginning about 1750, organized conversations of artists and writers at dinner, sometimes helped them financially, and introduced them to persons of influence in high society or in government. She welcomed visiting foreigners also, such as Horace Walpole and David Hume from England and young Stanislas Poniatowski before he became King of Poland. Because other women held similar salons, philosophies and other writers had frequent opportunity to meet and exchange ideas. Paris, the heart of the Enlightenment salons, became well-organized meeting places at which authors introduced new works to critical readers. Salonières read letters from travelers or distant correspondents, and lively conversations spread the reputations of aspiring philosophies. The leading salonières gave careful attention to the intellectual themes and social continuities of their salons. Suzanne Necker, whose salon met on Friday afternoons during the 1770s and 1780s, prepared for her weekly conversations by listing in her journal the ideas and books that she wanted to discuss. Julie de Lespinasse provided opportunities for almost constant discussion at her Parisian home, where she received visitors every evening of the week for 12 years. Her great art, wrote one admirer, was to show to advantage the minds of others, and she enjoyed doing that more than revealing her own. Salons and salonières promoted the ideals of a cosmopolitan republic of letters, in which talent and creativity counted for more than noble lineage. And though women lost much of their cultural influence after the 1780s, some salons of this kind survived the revolution. In 1795, after the Terror, the widows of two eminent philosophes, Helvetius and Condorcet, opened or reopened their salons in Paris for people of moderate Republican or liberal sentiments. Sophie Condorcet became a writer herself and a translator of Adam Smith. Her salon remained a center of liberal opposition during the years of Napoleon. More short-lived was the salon of the even more famous Germaine de Staël, who also wrote widely read books and who, among her many other ideas, deplored the subordination of women that the revolution had done little to change. 593. These post-revolutionary salons became social cultural meeting places in which much of France's 19th century liberalism would begin to emerge. Women in salons, 322. In Paris also, in the mid-18th century, the most serious of all philosophical enterprises, the Encyclopédie was published in 17 large volumes and completed over the years 1751 to 1772. Edited by Denis Diderot, it was a great compendium of scientific, technical, and historical knowledge, carrying a strong undertone of criticism of existing society and institutions, and epitomizing the skeptical, rational, and scientific spirit of the age. It was not the first encyclopedia, but it was the first to have a distinguished list of contributors, or to be conceived as a positive force for social progress. Virtually all the French philosophers contributed: Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, D'Alembert, who assisted in the editing, Buffon, Turgot, Quesnay, and many others, all sometimes collectively called the encyclopedists. Although edited in Paris, the Encyclopédie became very widely known and read. About 25,000 multi-volume sets were sold before the Revolution, about half of them outside France, because French had become an international language understood by educated persons all over Europe. Within France itself, the Encyclopédie was read in all parts of the country and in the most influential ranks of society. At Besançon, for example, a city of about 28,000 inhabitants, 137 sets were sold to local residents, of whom 15,323,594 were members of the clergy, 53 were of the nobility, and 69 were lawyers, doctors, merchants, government officials, or others of what was called the Third Estate. The privileged groups whom the encyclopedists most often criticized, that is, the clergy and the nobility, read the Encyclopédie, or at least purchased it far out of proportion to their numbers in the population as a whole. Diderot's Encyclopédie, a reading of Voltaire's tragedy. L'Orphelin de la Chine in the Salon of Madame Geoffrin by Anicet Charles Gabriel Lenomier, French, 1743 to 1824. The Salon of Madame de Geoffrin, depicted here by the artist Lemonnier, became one of the best-known meeting places for writers and artists in mid-18th century Paris. This imagined scene of someone reading from a work by Voltaire was painted early in the following century, but it shows the social style and enduring cultural reputation of famous salons and salonières. Heritage Images, Getty Images. 595 men and women who considered themselves philosophes, or close to the philosophes in spirit, were found all over Europe. Frederick the Great was an eminent philosopher. Not only was he the friend of Voltaire and host to a circle of literary and scientific men at Potsdam, but he also wrote epigrams, satires, and histories, as well as works on military science. And he had a gift of wit, a sharp tongue, and a certain impishness toward the traditional and the pompous. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, was also a philosopher for much the same reason. Maria Theresa of Austria was not a philosopher. She was too religious and too little concerned with general ideas. Her son Joseph, on the other hand, as we shall see, proved to be virtually a philosophy enthroned. In England, Bishop Warburton was considered by some of his friends as a philosopher. He held that the Church of England of his day, as a social institution, was exactly what pure reason would have invented. The Scottish skeptical philosopher David Hume also counted as a philosopher, as did Edward Gibbon, who shocked the pious by his attacks on Christianity in his famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Dr. Samuel Johnson was not a philosopher, though he was best known for a typical 18th century project, the compilation of a new dictionary of the English language. Johnson worried over the supernatural, adhered to the established church, deflated pretentious authors, and even declared that Voltaire and Rousseau were evil men who should be sent to the plantations. There were also Italian and German philosophers, like the Marquis di Beccaria, who condemned torture and sought to humanize the criminal law, or Baron Grimm, who sent a literary newsletter from Paris to his many subscribers. 596 Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Most famous of all philosophers were the French trio Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755, Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, and Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. They differed vehemently with each other, but all were hailed as literary geniuses in their own day. All turned from pure literature to works of political commentary and social analysis. All thought that the existing state of society could be improved. Montesquieu was a landed aristocrat, a seigneur or manorial lord in southwestern France. He inherited from his uncle a seat in the Parliament of Bordeaux and participated actively in that parliament after the death of Louis XIV. He was part of the noble resurgence that began about 1715 and continued on through the 18th century. Although he shared many of the ideas in the stream of aristocratic and anti-absolutist thought, he went beyond a mere self-centered class philosophy. In his great work, The Spirit of Laws, published in 1748, he developed two principal ideas. One of his political arguments asserted that forms of government varied according to climate and circumstances. He claimed, for example, that despotism was suited to large areas in hot climates and that democracy would work only in small city-states. His other great doctrine, aimed against royal absolutism in France, which he called despotism, strongly affirmed the need for a separation and balance of political powers. In France, he believed that power should be divided between the king and a great many intermediate bodies, parliaments, provincial estates, organized nobility, 324 Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws, 597 chartered towns, and even the church. His position as a judge in parliament, a provincial, and a nobleman gave him good reasons to favor the first three, and his work in Bordeaux helped him to recognize the importance of the bourgeoisie in French towns. As for the church, he observed that, while he took no stock in its teachings, he thought it useful as a barrier to undue centralization of government. He greatly admired the English Constitution, as he understood it, believing that England carried over, more successfully than any other country, the feudal liberties of the early Middle Ages. He thought that in England the necessary separation and balance of powers was obtained by an ingenious mixture of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, king, lords, and commons, and by a separation of the functions of the executive, legislature, and judiciary. This doctrine had a wide influence in Europe and was also well known to the Americans, who in 1787 wrote the Constitution of the United States. Montesquieu's own philosopher friends thought him too conservative and even tried to dissuade him from publishing his ideas. He was, indeed, technically a reactionary, favoring a scheme of things that antedated Louis XIV, and he was unusual among contemporaries in his admiration of the barbarous Middle Ages. This portrait of Voltaire, c. 1736, by Maurice Quentin de la Tour, suggests the playful, ironic style that made his works accessible and popular, even when he was attacking religious persecutions or the suppression of controversial ideas. Photo 12, Getty Images. Voltaire was born in 1694 into a comfortable bourgeois family and christened François-Marie Arouet. Voltaire, an invented name, is simply the most famous of all 18th century pen names. Until he was over 40, he was known only as a clever writer of epigrams, tragedies in verse, and an epic. Thereafter, he turned increasingly to philosophical and public questions. His strength throughout lay in the facility of his pen. He is the easiest of all great writers to read. He was always trenchant, logical, and incisive, sometimes 325 scurrilous, mocking and sarcastic when he wished to be, equally a master of deft irony and of withering ridicule. However serious in his purpose, he achieved it by getting his readers to laugh. Voltaire and Freedom of Thought, 598. In his youth, Voltaire spent 11 months in the Bastille for what was considered to be impertinence to the regent, who, however, in the next year rewarded him with a pension for one of his dramas. He was again arrested after a fracas with a nobleman, the Chevalier de Rohan, but he moved to England to avoid another imprisonment. He remained an incorrigible bourgeois, while never deeply objecting to the aristocracy on principle. Through his admirer Mimi de Pompadour, another bourgeois, though the king's favorite, he later became a gentleman of the bedchamber and royal historian to Louis de Faience. These functions he fulfilled in absentia, when at all, for Paris and Versailles were too unsafe for him. He was the personal friend of Frederick the Great, in whose household he lived for about 2 years at Potsdam. The two finally quarreled, for no stage was big enough to hold two such prima donnas for long. Voltaire made a fortune from his writings, pensions, speculations, and practical business sense. In his later years, he purchased a manor at Ferney, near the Swiss frontier. Here he became, as he said, the hotel keeper of Europe, receiving the streams of distinguished admirers, favor hunters, and distressed persons who came to seek him out. He died at Paris in 1778 at the age of 84, by far the most famous man of letters in Europe. His collected writings fill over 70 volumes. Voltaire was mainly interested in the freedom of thought. Like Montesquieu, he was an admirer of England. He spent 3 years in that country, where in 1727 he witnessed the state funeral accorded to Sir Isaac Newton and his burial in Westminster Abbey. Voltaire's Philosophical Letters on the English, 1733, and Elements of the Philosophy of Newton, 1738, not only brought England increasingly before the consciousness of the rest of Europe, but also popularized the new scientific ideas, the inductive philosophy of Bacon, the physics of Newton, and the psychology of Locke, whose doctrine that all true ideas arose from sense experience undercut the authority of religious belief. What Voltaire mainly admired in England was its religious liberty, its tolerance for diverse ideas and scientific inquiry, its relative freedom of the press, and its respect for men of letters like himself. Political liberty concerned him much less than it did Montesquieu. Louis XIV, whom Montesquieu and the neo-aristocratic school viewed critically as the 599 enemy of traditional liberties, was a hero for Voltaire. In opposition to the aristocratic critics, he wrote a laudatory Age of Louis XIV, 1751, praising the Sun King for the splendor of art and literature in his reign. Voltaire likewise continued to respect the policies of Frederick the Great, though he quarreled with him personally. Frederick was in fact almost his ideal of the enlightened ruler, a man who sponsored the arts and sciences, recognized no religious authority, and granted toleration to all creeds, welcoming Protestants and Catholics on equal terms if only they would be socially useful. After about 1740, Voltaire became more definitely the crusader, preaching the cause of religious toleration. He fought to clear the memory of Jean Calas, a Protestant who was tortured and put to death on the false charge of murdering a son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. He wrote also to exonerate a youth named Labarre, who had been executed for defiling a wayside cross. Écrasez l'infâme became the famous Voltairean war cry. Crush the infamous thing! The infamy for him was bigotry, intolerance, and superstition, and behind these, the power of an organized clergy. He assaulted not only the Catholic Church, but the whole traditional Christian view of the world as well. He argued for natural religion and natural morality, holding that belief in God and the difference between good and evil arose from reason itself. This doctrine had, in fact, long been taught by the Catholic Church. But Voltaire insisted that no supernatural revelation 326 was desirable or necessary because reason alone revealed essential truths and good human actions. Belief in a special supernatural revelation, he argued, made people intolerant, stupid, and cruel. 601 and all other organized religions as social phenomena or mere human inventions. Spinoza had said as much. Voltaire's engaging literary style helped to spread these ideas through Europe. In matters of politics and self-government, Voltaire was neither a liberal nor a Democrat. His opinion of the human race was about as low as his friend Frederick's. If only a government was enlightened, he did not care how powerful it was. By an enlightened government, he meant one that fought against sloth and stupidity, kept the clergy in a subordinate place, allowed freedom of thought and religion, encouraged the development of reason and science, and advanced the cause of material and technical progress. He had no developed political theory, but his ideal for large civilized countries approached that of enlightened or rational despotism. Believing that only a few could be enlightened, he thought that rational elites and kings 327 should have the power to carry out their program against all opposition. To overcome ignorance, credulity, and priestcraft, it was necessary for the state to be strong. What Voltaire most desired was liberty for the enlightened, or for people like himself. Voltaire on politics, 602. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was very different. Born in Geneva in 1712, he was a Swiss, a Protestant, and almost of lower class origin. He never felt at ease in France or in Parisian society. His mother died a few days after his birth, and he was neglected as a child. Running away from Geneva at age 16, he lived for years by odd jobs, such as copying music, and not until the age of 40 did he have any success as a writer. He was intellectually ambitious, but he viewed himself always as a social outsider. In addition, his personal relations with women were difficult and unstable. He finally settled down with an uneducated woman named Thérèse Levasseur and her mother. By Thérèse, he had 5 children, all of whom he deposited at an orphanage. He had no social status, no money, and no sense of money, and after he became famous, he lived largely by the generosity of his friends. He was pathetically and painfully maladjusted. He came to feel that he could trust no one, that those who tried to befriend him were deriding or betraying him behind his back. He condemned the cultural influence of French women, criticizing especially their prominent role in Parisian salons. They do not know anything, although they judge everything. He suffered from what would now be termed psychological complexes. Possibly, he was paranoid. He talked endlessly of his own virtue and innocence and complained bitterly that he was misunderstood. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 6003. But unbalanced though he was possibly the most profound writer of the age and was certainly the most permanently influential. Rousseau felt, from his own experience, that in society as it existed, a good person could not be happy. He therefore attacked society, declaring that it was artificial and corrupt. He even attacked reason, calling it a false guide when followed without feelings or emotions. He felt doubts about the social and cultural progress that gave satisfaction to his contemporaries. In 2 discourses, one on the arts and sciences, 1750, the other on the origin of inequality among men, 1753, he argued that civilization was the source of much evil and that life in a state of nature, were it only possible, would be much freer, and all people in such conditions would be far more equal. As Voltaire said, when Rousseau sent him a copy of his second discourse, Voltaire, who relished civilization in every form, it made him feel like going on all fours. To Rousseau, the best traits of human character, such as kindness, unselfishness, honesty, and true understanding between different persons, were products of nature rather than the social progress of modern civilizations. Deep below reason, he sensed the presence of feeling. He delighted in the warmth of sympathy, the quick flash of intuition, the clear message of conscience. He was religious by temperament, for though he believed in no church, no clergy, and no revelation, he had a respect for the Bible, a reverent awe toward the cosmos, a love of solitary meditation, and a belief in a God who was not merely a first cause, but also a God of love and beauty. Rousseau thus made it easier for serious-minded people to slip away from orthodoxy and all forms of churchly discipline. He was feared by the churches as the most dangerous of all infidels, and was condemned both in Catholic France and Protestant Geneva. Rousseau's discourses. In general, in most of his books, Rousseau, unlike so many of his contemporaries, gave the impression that impulse is more reliable than considered judgment, spontaneous feeling more to be trusted than critical thought. Mystical insights were for him more truthful than rational or clear ideas. He became the man of feeling, the child of nature, the forerunner of the coming age of Romanticism, and an important source of all modern 328-604 emphasis on the non-rational and the subconscious. He thus became an early, influential critic of the Enlightenment, even as he resembled other philosophers in his desire to change the existing social order. In The Social Contract, 1762, however, Rousseau seemed to contradict much of his famous sentiment for nature and to argue for the value of a well-organized government. In this book, he held, somewhat like Hobbes, that the state of nature was a brutish condition without law or morality. In other works, he had held that human evil was due to the evils of society. He now held that good people could be produced only by an improved society. Earlier thinkers, such as John Locke, for example, had thought of the contract as an agreement between a ruler and a people. Rousseau thought of it as an agreement among the people themselves. It was a social, not merely a political, contract. Organized civil society, that is, the community, rested upon it. The social contract was an understanding by which all individuals surrendered their natural liberty to each other, fused their individual wills into a combined general will, and agreed to accept the rulings of this general will as final. This general will was the sovereign, and true sovereign power, rightly understood, was absolute, sacred, and inviolable. He preferred republics, but government institutions were secondary. Kings, officials, or elected representatives were only delegates of a sovereign people. Rousseau devoted many difficult pages to explaining how the real general will could be known. It was not necessarily determined by vote of a majority. What generalizes the will, he said, is not the number of voices, but the common interest that unites them. He said little of the mechanism of government and had no admiration for parliamentary institutions. He was concerned with something deeper. Maladjusted outsider that he was, he craved a commonwealth in which every person could feel that he or she belonged. He wished a state in which all persons had a sense of membership and participation. The Social Contract 605.5. By these ideas, Rousseau made himself the prophet of both democracy and nationalism. Indeed, in his Considerations on Poland, written at the request of Poles who were fighting against the partitions of their nation's territories by foreign powers, Rousseau applied the ideas of the social contract in more concrete form and became the first systematic theorist of a conscious and calculated nationalism. In writing The Social Contract, he had in mind a small republican city-state like his native Geneva. But what he did, in effect, was to generalize and make applicable to large territories the psychology of small city republics. The sense of membership, of community and fellowship, of responsible citizenship and intimate participation in public affairs. In short, of a common and collective will. All modern states, democratic or undemocratic, strive to impart this sense of moral solidarity to their peoples. Whereas in democratic states, the general will can in some way be identified with the sovereignty of the people. In dictatorships, it becomes possible for individuals, or parties, to arrogate to themselves the right to serve as spokesmen and interpreters of the general will. Both totalitarians and Democrats have regarded Rousseau as one of their prophets. Rousseau's influence on his contemporaries spread also through his other writings, especially his theories of education in Emile, 1762, and his popular novel Julie, or the New Heloise, 1760. His novels were widely read in all literate classes of society, by men and especially by women, who found an emotional resonance in characters such as the ill-fated Julie, and who made a kind of cult of Jean-Jacques. He was a literary master, able to evoke shades of thought and feeling that few writers had touched before. His literary writings helped to spread in the highest circles a new respect for the common person, a love of common things, an impulse of human pity and compassion, and a sense of the 329-606 artifice or superficiality in aristocratic life. Women took to nursing their own babies, as Rousseau said they should. Men began describing the delicacy of their sentiments. Tears became the fashion. The queen, Marie Antoinette, built herself a village in the gardens at Versailles, where she pretended to be a simple milkmaid. In all this, there was much that was shallow or contrived, or completely disconnected from the lives of people in a real peasant village. Yet this new interest in the lives of lower-class persons became the wellspring of modern humanitarianism, the force leading to a new sense of human equality. Rousseau estranged the French upper classes from their own mode of life. He made many of them lose faith in their own superiority. That was his main direct contribution to the French Revolution, even more significant than his political theories about the general will. Political economists in France, somewhat apart from the philosophers, were the physiocrats, whom their critics called economists, a word originally thought to be mildly insulting. Many of the physiocrats, unlike the philosophers, were close to the government as administrators or advisors. Quesnay was physician to Louis XV. Turgot was an experienced official who became minister to Louis XVI, and Dupont de Nemours, an associate of Turgot's, became the founder of the industrial family of the Duponts in the United States. Such advisors concerned themselves with fiscal and tax reform and with measures to increase the national wealth of France. They argued that agriculture, Grain production and efficient uses of the land provided essential economic foundations for an expanding national commerce. Moving away from earlier mercantilist strategies for government control of trade, they opposed guild regulations and price controls as impediments to the production and circulation of goods. The physiocrats were the first to use the term laissez-faire, let them do as they see fit, as a principle of economic activity. And some proposed that even the grain trade should operate without government interventions, a politically risky proposal that no French king would ever accept. They favored strong government, however, relying on it to overcome traditional obstacles and to provide inducements for the establishment of new industries. Physiocrats' 607 economics, or what was long called political economy, arose from these activities of the physiocrats, from the somewhat similar work of cameralists in the German states, and from the collection and analysis of quantitative data, that is, the birth of statistics. Political economy thus became another example of the belief that scientific methods should be used to understand human societies as well as nature. Economic thinking flourished especially in Great Britain, and notably in Scotland, where Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations appeared in 1776. By 1800, The Wealth of Nations had been translated into every Western European language except Portuguese. Adam Smith's purpose, like that of the French physiocrats, was to increase the national wealth by the reduction of barriers that hindered its growth. He undercut the premises of what we have called the struggle for wealth and empire, because he argued that to build up a nation's wealth, it was unnecessary to have an empire. He attacked most of the program of mercantilism that had evolved since the 16th century, and he expected that Britain's American colonies would soon become independent without loss to British trade. Where others looked to planning by an enlightened government, Adam Smith preferred to limit the functions of 330 government to defense, internal security, and the provision of reasonable laws and fair law courts by which private differences could be adjudicated. For innovation and enterprise, he counted more on private persons than on the state. He became the philosopher of the free market, the prophet of free trade. If there was a shortage of a given commodity, its price would rise, and so stimulate producers to produce more, while also attracting new persons into that line of production. If there was an excess, if more was produced than purchasers would buy, both capital and labor would withdraw and gradually move into another area where demand was stronger. Demand would increase with lower prices, which depended on lower costs, which in turn depended on the specialization or division of labor. His most famous example was that of the pin factory of his time, where each of a dozen workers engaged in only one part of the process of manufacture, so that together they produced far more pins than if each worker produced whole pins. The price of pins then fell, and more pins could be used by more people. The same principle held in international trade. Some countries or climates could produce an article more cheaply than others, so that if each specialized and then exchanged with the others, all would have more. Each nation could use its comparative advantage in certain spheres of production or trade to compensate for economic weaknesses in other spheres, and also to increase its national wealth. Adam Smith, 608 by David Martin, Scottish 1737 to 1797, after Allan Ramsay, Scottish 1713 to 1784. Some hints of the complexities of Rousseau's personality and thought, including his desire for the clothing of a natural man, appear in this portrait by a Scottish artist who studied with the portrait painter Allan Ramsay, National Gallery of Art. 331, 609. The motivation for all such production and exchange was to be the self-interest of the participants. As he said, we rely for our meat not on the goodwill of the butcher, but on his concern for his own income. To those who might object that this was a system of selfishness, Adam Smith would reply, being a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, that a free market system was at least realistic, describing how people really behaved, and that a free market system was morally justified because it ultimately produced a maximum of both freedom and abundance. The mutual interaction of the enlightened self-interest of millions of persons would in the end, as if by an invisible hand, he said, result in the highest welfare of all. Among problems that Smith minimized or accepted as lesser evils were the economic insecurity of individuals, the destabilizing political consequences of extreme differences in wealth, and the dangers of excessive dependence of a whole country on imports of essential goods such as food. If the visible hand of government continued to regulate the price of bread, for example, such actions showed how economic policies still had to fit within the broader political goals of governments that wanted to prevent rioting, ensure social peace, and retain popular support. Main currents of Enlightenment thought. It is clear that the main currents of 18th century thought in France and Europe were divergent and inconsistent. There was a general belief in progress, reason, science, and the advance of knowledge in European civilization, but there were also critics of every influential idea. Rousseau had his doubts about progress and praised the imagined conditions in a pre-civilized state of nature. Montesquieu thought the church useful but did not believe in religion. Rousseau believed in religion but saw no need for any church. Montesquieu was concerned about practical political liberty. Voltaire would surrender political liberty in return for guarantees of intellectual freedom. Rousseau wanted emancipation from the restraints of society and sought the freedom that consists in merging with nature and with one's fellows. Most philosophers were closest to Voltaire. They favored more tolerance for intellectual differences and more legal equality in European societies. It was not a very far-reaching conception of equality, but it meant equality of rights for persons of different religions, a reduction of privileges enjoyed by nobles but not by commoners, greater equality of status in law courts and in the payment of taxes, and more opportunity for middle-class persons to rise to positions of social or political importance. France was the main center of the Enlightenment. French philosophers traveled all over Europe. Frederick II and Catherine II invited French thinkers to their courts. French was the language of the academies of St. Petersburg and Berlin. Frederick wrote his philosophical works in the French language. The upper classes of Europe shared a uniform cosmopolitan culture, and this culture was predominantly French. But Britain was important also. Hitherto somewhat on the fringes of the European consciousness, Britain now moved closer to the center. 612 Montesquieu and Voltaire may be said to have discovered Britain for Europe. Through them, the ideas of Bacon, Newton, and Locke, and the whole theory of British liberty, parliamentary government, and public debate became matters for general European discussion. We have seen, too, how Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations was soon translated into many languages. Although the physiocrats and others had begun to advocate laissez-faire economic theories, the state was widely viewed as the main agent of social progress. Whether in the form of limited monarchy on the British model favored by Montesquieu, or of enlightened despotism preferred by Voltaire, or of the idealized Republican Commonwealth portrayed by Rousseau, the rightly ordered government was considered the best guarantee of social welfare. Even the political economists needed the state to shake people out of the habits of ages, sweep away a mass of local regulation, preserve law and order and the enforcement of contracts, and so assure the existence of a free market. But if they relied on the state, they were not nationalists in any later sense of the word. As universalists, they believed in the unity of humankind under a natural law of right and reason, and thus they carried over classical and Christian beliefs in a more secular framework. Although they generally believed that different cultures and racial groups had reached very different levels of civilization in the 18th century, they supposed that all peoples would participate eventually in the same progress. No nation was thought to have a distinctive message or unique path to progress. French ideas enjoyed a wide currency, but no one thought of them as peculiarly French, arising from a French national character. It was simply thought that the French at the time were in the vanguard of civilized, universalist thinking. Such was the idea of Condorcet, one of the later philosophies, a leading spokesman of the Enlightenment who became an active figure in the French Revolution, and also one of its victims, and who in 1794 while in hiding from his radical political enemies, wrote the great testament to the Enlightenment, his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind.